Yeah, I was just wondering, with this emphasis on national liberation, don't you run the risk of kind of creating these anti-capitalist islands who are then besieged by the larger, more numerous capitalist countries, like happened in Cuba, like happened in Russia, happened in Cuba, happened in Russia?
Yeah, no, that's what happens.
So, I mean, why choose to emphasize national liberation instead of global revolution?
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is national liberation is a particular tactic used against particular imperialists. You'll notice, I don't advocate for national liberation, qua national liberation, for the RSU. But it does make sense to support, well, it did make sense to support black liberation as national liberation. Because it's always a pragmatic means of confronting imperialism. Now, of course, my response to you, right? You say as opposed to global liberation. I mean, I've sort of addressed that, but I would actually, I'm going to repose this question: national liberation opposed to what? Right? Where is the what of this global liberation? It sucks really bad that Cuba is a besieged, relatively poor nation that has very few, if any, major political allies and has to basically do it on its own. Also, UNICEF just released a report. Cuba is one of, I believe it is literally the only Latin American nation with no child malnutrition. I'm comfortable with failures like that. And I would always advocate for failed national liberation over any sort of idealist, non-materialist plan or rhetoric that doesn't cash out in a substantive way. And again, I'd highly actually recommend both of you read. Again, it sounds like a critique of Negri coming out of Lenin. But Lenin critiques Karl Kautsky's notion of ultra-imperialism. And of course, the notion of ultra-imperialism is that all these imperialist states get together and start to mitigate their differences so that they can globally oppress people in a more efficient manner. I mean, and if for those of you who have read Negri and Hart, this sounds like empire. And of course, right, Lenin rips it to shreds that no, as a matter of fact, all this will do is heighten the tensions, which we see. We have no Soviet Union. We have an emphasis on the UN, the WTO, the IMF, and have we become a more peaceful society with universal American hegemony? Not at all. And so, I mean, that would be my response.
To put this in the Badu framework, the notion of naming the void as opposed to naming the eventual site, can we see the distinction between, in Nazi Germany, they named the void, rather as opposed to national liberation and say, I'm trying to think of any successful ones.
No,
well, the point I'm going to make is this, though, right? If it turns into national liberation, qua national liberation, in order to reproduce bourgeois society, capitalist society, under the pretense of, say, like Germany did or Italy did, then that's naming the void. This is sort of for me, but not.
Yeah, well, I'll try and adopt that, no offense, so it's useful for other people.
Sure.
Okay, here's the thing. Nazi Germany. What is Nazi Germany fighting for? Purity. What's purity? Where is purity? Right? Purity is not a concept that can ever actualize. It can never be instantated. And so essentially what they named was they named nothing. They named a void. They named it, and not only did they name it, they built their entire framework around this void. And what happened? Collapse. Right? Because there's literally nothing to not National Socialism. There's nothing to it. Whereas a failed revolution, right, which ultimately, right, names the void, in a certain sense, right, the French Revolution. At some point, someone named the French Revolution. They said, this is the French Revolution. What is the French Revolution about? Equality, right, liberty, and fraternity, right? And what you'll notice is that these notions, even in its failure, right, instantated in French society. Haiti was one of the first nations, right, to abolish slavery, and they did so under the French Revolution. And you'll notice we are permeated now with these notions, whereas Nazism itself is reviled, right, and nauseating to us. because again, there's nothing to it. It doesn't name anything. It's the difference between naming nothing and naming an infinite truth, which is, again, the equality of all. And so national liberation that names itself as simply, I need mine, or I got mine, Jack, or any of, actually, this is a good example. Look at Africa today. Now, and I don't mean to pick on Africa because obviously most of the damage was imperialist, but when you have ethnic groups, right, naming themselves, right, as the reason for fighting, as Hutu, as Tutsi, right, very rarely is it an actual motion for national liberation. It's a desire to become a new set of capitalists. Whereas, for example, Evo Morales, even though he names indigenismo, right, indigenism, it's not just for the indigenous, right? It's not just whitey go home, right? It's something more. It's something universal in its naming. So, is that?
That's great. Thank you.
Anything else, or should we wrap it up?
Does anybody else have any pressing questions on imperialism?
Objections?
The things you just described, like trying to relate it back to the lecture you gave on Maoism, or I can't remember if it's historical or Mao, recognizing the principal contradiction and not the secondary contradictions.
Exactly. Yeah, and so national liberation is only a principal contradiction if it is a matter of capitalist principle. So, for example, being against Vietnam and supporting Vietnam's national liberation, right, is something different from, say, supporting, I don't know,
Free Tibet.
Yeah, Free Tibet. Free Tibet is a good example. And so these would be a secondary as opposed to primary contradiction, if that makes sense.
All right, let's give Greg a hand.